Yeah, so just something a little different. I'll turn the lights down. When you look at the Earth, you'll see it in different ways. And I'm sure Ian would look at this and go, well, there's a nice mountain chain, continental collisions, impact craters, all this sort of stuff. Jenny might start looking at the sea. I'd probably look at the green things there, which tells us about where plants are. And the thing I'd like to get across is the fact that life and the Earth are just completely inseparable things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the green stuff. I'm also going to talk about this blue stuff. This is Bahamas, which is a very nice place to go and work if you are able to do that, which I haven't yet been able to, but I'm working on that particular project. So we'll end up here in the Bahamas, I think. So life on Earth is just completely inseparable. Many of the important events, moments, great moments in the history of the Earth are biological ones. For example, the beginnings of photosynthesis and the great oxygenation crisis that occurred at about 2.3 billion years ago. Examples of early things that happened in the history of Earth that have profound effects on the way that everything works. For example, if we went to go and find iron minerals, then we have to look very back to this early oxygenation of the Earth to explain why iron minerals are formed in the places they are, just as a example. So what we teach in our group is the evolution and diversity of life. And we're dealing with things which are so small that you can't see them, to vast trees, and from the deep lithosphere, where there are things living, up through the sea and the soil, and even into the atmosphere. And the way that impacts on what we call the Earth system, the way that the whole system of the Earth is working. My particular interest is in the evolution of land plants, which occurred about here in the great scheme of things. So you can see most of life history, most of Earth history has already been gone by then, but we're going back about 370 million years. And I'm interested in this time we call the transition to a forested planet. So you have to imagine an Earth without trees, just with little plants maybe, and before that smaller and smaller plants, till we're just worrying about thin films of microbial mats doing things. And after this transition to a forested planet, then we come to the Carboniferous Forests. So those of you from South Wales know all about coal fields and so on, the time when we get significant accumulations of carbon from coal. And it's a period about 12 million years that this happens. I'll take you over to New York State and then up to Svalbard in the Norwegian Arctic. I spend a lot of my time worrying about just what trees look like. One of the problems with working with fossil plants is that plants fall apart when they die, and you end up with a few leaves, a few spores, and a few twigs, and a couple of roots, and they're not generally joined together. So much of my last 30 years has been trying to assemble these trees into living things. And I'm sure most of you have never seen trees which look like this, but these are things called cladoxylopsids. They're the first trees to significantly impact on the planet's environment. And they got bigger. This is a meter scale bar, and bigger and bigger. And this is the stump of a big tree from upstate New York called Eospermatopteris, which is about 1 meter in diameter and obviously quite heavy to deal with. So not only have we tried to discover what these plants look like, but we've also tried to understand how they grow in forests together. So this is the bottom of a quarry in upstate New York at Gilboa, where you can see these imprints here and then all over the surface where these tree stumps were standing. And having an understanding of that and understanding of the plants themselves allow us to consider reconstructing these very early forests as not just specimens, but a whole living system with big rooting systems and interaction between plants and so on. And that allows us to reconstruct them. This is a reconstruction by an architectural artist called Ken Dowd, who's taken all our data and built it into a living, three-dimensional model of a forest that you can sort of walk around in. One of the things we have to take account of when we're looking at life history is just the vastness of the depth of time, the time we're talking about, and obviously that includes continents moving around. So it's strange to think it, but New York used to be in the southern hemisphere, about 30 degrees south at this time, and Arctic Norway was on the equator. So we had, ironically, to head north to discover what tropical vegetation was like at this time, because we know that tropical vegetation is the most important vegetation in terms of biomass and what it's doing to the environment. So Spitsbergen is a fantastic place to work. There's lots of interesting scenery and glaciers and everything like that, but it's in the river banks of this valley where we find another sort of forest growing. You can just make out a tree right here in the soil beneath it, which it was growing in. And this is a second type of tree which still has living relatives, though they tend to be quite small today, called the lycopods or lycopsids. And this is my personal attempt to reconstruct this stand of trees. You can see the individual little trees here growing together in the side of the river valley. And again, this is Ken's more naturalistic reconstruction using that same spatial data in our reconstructions of the trees. There's a third type of forest that we find in Spitsbergen in the side of these little rivers with standing upright trees. These trees are made out of solid wood. They're the first trees to actually have a solid trunk that you could carve and use for building buildings and so on. And this type of tree is called Archaeopteryx. In this case, it's actually named after Svalbard, the island of Svalbard. These trees form the earliest log jams that you find in river channels, so they actually can block up a river channel and divert the flow. In Spitsbergen, they're really quite small, but if we go back to New York State and look at the quarry floors in upstate New York, you can find the rooting systems of these plants are absolutely massive. So you have to go out and buy yourself a drone in order to fly around and photograph these things. So you can see during this transition to a forested planet, the trees got bigger and bigger and bigger. And a lot of this is detail. So we try and find plant fossils and uncover them, dig them out of the rock, and then make reconstructions of the leaves, the branches, the anatomy, the trunks with the branches attached to them. So this is one place where students are very helpful and very willing to get involved with this time-consuming process of digging out fossils. You've obviously seen people doing dinosaurs, digging out dinosaurs on the television. We do the same in miniature with our plant fossils. And this is a third-year student's project to reconstruct the branch of one of these trees. This is a reconstruction of the Archaeopteryx tree branch, just one of the branches. And you can see he's made a magnificent job of this. It's just a shame now that we have widescreen screens that trees are sort of stand this way and the screen goes sideways. So we have to lie things down sometimes to make them more visible. So Archaeopteryx was a really significant tree because it was a woody tree. Here's a picture of one of the trunks of these things. These could get very, very large indeed by the end of the Devonian period. So going back to Spitsbergen, I was very interested in what was supposed to be the most primitive type of this Archaeopteryx tree. So I was interested in the way that the leaves are arranged, and we set up an expedition to go back and collect some of this material and then to destroy it. So I got another student to do this. If it's your own material, you can destroy it. If it's in a museum, you can't. So we took this stuff apart just to find out whether it really was primitive. And his work on these fossils showed that it was actually a very sophisticated plant. The branch has lots of leaves on one side, we call that the sunny side, and on the other side it didn't have many leaves, that's a shade side, and then it had laterally symmetrical branches. And what he showed from this work was that this supposedly primitive form of Archaeopteryx tree was in fact a tropical form, very sophisticated tropical form, and not some archaic ancient thing which just wasn't very well developed. So that's a really good example of a student getting totally involved in my research. So paleontology is great. We get to travel a lot. We get to do all sorts of interesting things. But what did these plants do to the planet? Well, here is a diagram showing carbon dioxide through time, modeled and measured in various different ways. And you can see that carbon dioxide has changed over time. And we know now that we're worried about percentages of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and so on. This is a scale of multiples of the present day carbon dioxide levels, going up to 5, 10, 15. And you can see that when my trees began to grow, then there was maybe 15 times as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as there is now. And during the Devonian period, this dropped right down, such that by the time you get to the Carboniferous, a few million years later, then there were ice ages. So there was glaciation at the poles. So the world went from being very, very warm to being much like it is today. And it's just worth mentioning how this happens. What are the plants doing to do that? Well, they're taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and you know that because coal seams are, it's bad to burn coal, right, and put it back up into the atmosphere. So plants take carbon out of the atmosphere and build the plant, which is essentially carbon, and if you can bury it somewhere where it doesn't decay, then you can take that carbon out of the atmosphere. But actually, that's not that important. What's really important is what's happening in the roots. The rooting system of these ancient plants and living plants have all sorts of bacteria and fungi working with them to really efficiently mine their way through the broken up rock which forms the soil. So they break down minerals, like a soil silicate mineral, which is a basic component of the Earth's crust, and they mix that up with a little bit of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water. And what happens is a weathered rock, and it puts the calcium and the carbon into solution in the form of calcium ions and bicarbonate ions. So they actually go into the water around the roots. And that can be washed through the floodplains, into rivers, and out into the sea. So it's taken that atmospheric carbon and put it into the sea. The next thing that happens is it goes off to somewhere like the Bahamas. And there's lots of interesting processes going on. Some of them involve things like shells. This is my happy photograph of the day. There's a little happy chappy here. So there's a shell in the middle of that structure, which is called an ooid, which is about 1 millimeter in diameter. And that's rolled around and bounced around in the sea and got gradually coated with calcium carbonate and then been deposited on the rock, the seafloor as limestone. So what's happened is that the bicarbonate and calcium ions, which have been produced by the plants, put into the water, run down the river, into the sea, have now become calcium carbonate. One of the carbon ions has been released as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but the other one has been captured in the form of limestone. And if you go to somewhere like the Bahamas, you have a pile of rock which is about 4 kilometers thick and hundreds of miles across, completely made up of calcium carbonate, and that carbon, much of it has come from the activity of plants hundreds of miles away and back in the geological past. So there's a really important process going on here. And increasingly I enjoy teaching this sort of carbonate sedimentology, which a lot of it's biology, to students. And in fact, this is I made this peel, but one of my students picked this up in a practical and said, look, who's this little chap in the rock? So there's a link between the plants and the history of plants and the deposition and capture of carbon and its storage into the ocean floor. And indeed, if you go to, for example, Kazakhstan, they have this in Kazakhstan. It doesn't look like this anymore. It's been buried under the ground. This huge, great porous pile of calcium carbonate, which is covered in caprock, is now a massive oil reservoir. So these processes are really, really important. So the things that we do in our research group are taught throughout our many degree courses. So you can see that there are lots of things to do with paleontology, chemistry and biology of the environment, sedimentology, pedology, the study of soils, biochemistry, marine processes and so on, and specialist modules as well. But also earth science projects are great ways of getting involved in the teaching and research of your staff. And this is how much of our research is carried through to the students. I also should mention there's a very nice course on coral reefs as well. But of course we teach these in the field, so we take our students into the field and take them on field trips. I particularly enjoy the paleobiology one to Wenlock Edge, but we also take them to see dinosaur footprints. We take them to coal mines, we collect fossil plants, and then we bring them back to the lab, and we all spend a considerable period of time learning to identify them and cataloguing them and curating them for museum collections and so on. So directly with the sorts of things I do in my research, I teach to the students directly. So I very much look forward to seeing you at lunch, and I hope you have some questions for me then. Thank you.